Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is a rarity, someone who has had privileged access to one of the world's most mysterious leaders, Bashar al-Assad, Syria's president, who has been in the news, of course, in recent weeks as his regime crushes a wave of protests. Several years ago, the Syrian president opened up with an American scholar by the name of David Lesh, who's a professor of Middle East history at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. This resulted in a biography of al-Assad published in 2005. Both men then kept contact, and this became a kind of unofficial channel between the United States and Syria. David Lesh joins us via satellite from New York City. Mr. Lesh, thank you for being on the France 24 interview.
My pleasure.
First of all, I want to ask you, how is Bashar al-Assad? I understand you say he's kind of a low-key persona. How is he really?
Well, he is that. He had a non-traditional path to the presidency. He had a life apart from the usual path toward a Middle East ruler as an ophthalmologist. And I think his demeanor, his nature reflected that. He was unassuming, unpretentious, unprepossessing, seemed like a pretty normal guy, a good family man, and very welcoming. He's not an intimidating figure, not the image of the typical Middle East dictator or Middle East ruler.
I want to read a sentence from your book. You say, Bashar's story reminds me very much of that of Michael Corleone in the Godfather movie. What do you mean by that?
Well, at first, I meant that, as Michael Corleone in the Godfather movies, that he was not earmarked to be the Godfather, to take over for his father. He had a different life, and this was very similar to Bashar al-Assad, who, as I said earlier, was an ophthalmologist. It was only when his older brother died in a car accident in 1994 that they started grooming him for the presidency. However, now that analogy and characterization may be more apt, because just as Michael Corleone in the Godfather movies became his father, it seems that Bashar al-Assad as well, with the current crackdown, maybe already has become his father.
So you've met him repeatedly between 2004 and 2006. You maintained contact. When was the last time you spoke or were in contact with him?
In late 2008.
Right. And since then, have you tried to talk to him, or especially in recent weeks or months?
Yes, I have tried. After that period in 2009, 2010, it was a period when Syria was breaking out from its isolation, and he was very busy traveling, meeting leaders, so he didn't have as much time for an academic to meet with him. In the last 6 months or so, I've tried to contact him, to go over and meet with him, and basically to see, is this the same person I knew? Did he change? Because I have seen changes in him over the years. Has he become, the prototypical Middle East dictator that a lot of people, the caricature, the negative character and image that most people have of him today?
Right. You do mention a few months ago, I read in an article that you saw some change already back in 2007 in his nature, kind of morphing from this low-key, accidental leader into someone else.
Yes, absolutely. It was during the 2007 referendum when he, quote-unquote, won re-election to another 7-year term, and I met with him during the election process and all of the pomp and circumstance that surrounded it, which was very a-characteristic and atypical of him, because he had eschewed the personality cult, but I saw it creeping in at that time because it was cultivated in order for the regime to survive, in order for him to be a persona around whom people could rally. And I saw in him personally, in talking to him, that he really believed it. He started to believe to the sycophants around him that had been praising him for years. And this is, again, very typical of even the most well-intentioned authoritarian leaders. They start to believe the press and the propaganda that the regime itself generates. And instead of that person essentially changing the system as we had all hoped, I started to see that the system was changing him. And he was, power is an aphrodisiac, and power corrupts absolutely. And I started to see those changes in 2007. And I think that is a partial explanation of why and how he is acting today.
There is one big question about today's events: is he in control, or are those around him, especially the Mukhabarat, the security forces, maybe his half-brother Maher, who's been mentioned repeatedly as the brain behind the repression, who is in control? Is it Bashar or those around him?
Actually, at the risk of sounding ambiguous, the answer is both. Bashar is in control. He is at the top of the pyramid without question. But even during normal times, he has to bargain, negotiate, manipulate various powerful forces at the top and within the bureaucracy and in the military security apparatus just to get the most mundane things done. So in a crisis situation, there are powerful figures around him to whom he has to listen, and he has to take into account before he enacts any sort of policy. So he is in control, but he's not in absolute control.
Right. Do you think that maybe when you described him in your book as someone who is willing to reform the system from within, you were naive?
No, I think we were hopeful. Because, again, he had that non-traditional background, because of the persona that he portrayed and he gave to people from all over that met him, had the same sort of impression that he was a reformer. And he was enacting reforms in administrative reforms, economic reforms, monetary reforms. Political reforms lagged far behind. In the 2005 Ba'ath Regional Congress, he announced a lot of political reforms. It's been implementation that's been lagging. So I think it was more hopeful. But in the sense that, you know, was there some naivete of an authoritarian system eventually corrupts the people within, then perhaps that was naive.
Right. I want to ask you about the regime's claim that, you know, the current unrest is being done, I should say, from outside, and that there's also an Islamist agenda. How much truth is there in this?
There's always a little bit of truth. There's a grain of truth in it to provide the regime with some evidence to make such statements. But largely, of course, it's an internal uprising that has socioeconomic and political causes internally rather than from the outside. The problem in Syria is that you know, there is a general paranoia and sense of conspiracy that pervades the entire population. And so when Bashar al-Assad, in his various speeches after the uprising began, started blaming conspiracies and external enemies and armed groups, it resonated with the public that tends to believe that anyway. Whereas we on the outside, and diplomats in the UN, the United States, and Europe, we see that, and we see that as an attempt to deflect the real causes. I just hope he really doesn't believe that, but the longer this goes on, the more I question whether he does or not.
I mean, he's promised reform repeatedly in recent months. Is there any hope that he is thinking about this, or given what's happened, it's just too late?
Thinking about reform, I think if I met with him today, he would tell me, as he has in the past, I'm getting no credit for anything I've done. Several times I've talked to him about these critical type moments. And he always felt that the West didn't give him enough credit for the reforms, the progress he has made in the country, because reform and change in Syria is incremental at best. It's a very inert system where it takes a long time even for small changes to really take root. So in any other period, the changes he has announced would be revolutionary. And I think he believes that to be the case. But the question is implementation, and they're not being implemented. And, you know, the basic call of stopping the violence has not been heeded. So I think everyone sees this as just a veneer over, you know, a repressive apparatus that wants to stay in power at all costs. But he personally, unfortunately, I believe that he thinks he really has made serious concessions. And that's the different wavelengths. That's the conceptual gap, I think, between the people outside of Syria and the regime itself.
The United States, again, asked him to leave. Even Russia hinted that. Is there any chance you think he could stay in power in Syria for a long time?
Oh, I think there's definitely a chance. I think his legitimacy domestically has been irreversibly undermined. I mean, he had a genuine popularity in the country, or at least not reviled over the years. He's lost all that, which is not all of it, but he's lost a great deal of it. But, you know, the military security apparatus, the Ba'ath Party, and the business community and some important religious clerics have stayed with him. There have been no significant defections from the regime. They have the military apparatus and wherewithal to stay in power and hopefully just drag this out into a stalemate, prolonged stalemate where the international community loses interest. So I think there's a chance, certainly a good chance, that this could be a prolonged situation for some time to come, but it also could devolve into civil war based on just incidents happening that we don't know about yet.
Right. I mean, that was my next question. Do you think that an Iraqi-style civil war could be in store for Syria?
It could be, especially because, unfortunately, I see the increasing militarization of the opposition, particularly if there are, as stories come out, that there are members of the army and soldiers defecting and bringing their arms with them. And various groups from the outside start sending arms in more so than they have in the past. If that happens, that actually probably would serve regime interest because it would feed into the narrative that they're of an armed grouping, an armed opposition, that they're trying to convince those people sitting on the fence that that's why they're protecting the people, not actually repressing the people. But unfortunately, this might happen. Right now we're at a critical period. This might be the last best chance for a peaceful transition to occur, with Russia involving itself much more in the diplomatic aspect, the diplomatic side of this, with a possible opposition organization developing that may acquire international recognition. Obviously, the regime is very worried about this. If that dynamic develops, there may be a chance for some sort of peaceful transition along the lines of the Arab League proposal that they made to Bashar al-Assad a few weeks ago.
Okay, David Lesh, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom on Bashar al-Assad and on Syria. And thank you all for watching this edition of The Interview here on France 24.